The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back. Senators, Twins, baseball, past, present, and future. I'm Ralph Tycho of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and we have a George Case III production today. I'm going to, without any further ado, turn it to him to introduce everyone who's here. George Case III. How are you, sir?
Yeah, just fine, Ralph. Thank you very much. This is going to be an enjoyable session for me because I believe our subject that we're going to talk about is Mickey Vernon, and two of my very good friends are going to be on the podcast with us. Jim Vankoski, who worked with me in producing our DVD, Ballfield to Battlefield and Back, from FDR to JFK, which includes the color footage and narration by my father as well as Mickey Vernon. And Jim also...
Wait, let me interrupt. Where can folks get that in case we get distracted?
As we it's available. It's available on our website, Ralph, which is www.timelessbaseball.com. And anybody who is interested in buying the DVD, all they have to do is click on it, purchase it, and we'll take care of it from there. I started to mention that Jim was also, at one time, was the director of the Mickey Vernon Sports History Museum in Media, Pennsylvania, which is now gone into more of a Delaware County sports history museum format in Pennsylvania, and Jim will talk about that. And our other guest is Rich Westcott, who I met a few years ago when Rich was writing a book on Mickey Vernon called Mickey Vernon, the Gentleman First Baseman, and Rich can talk about that. I was able to provide quite a bit of information to Rich for his book because Mickey and my dad and Mickey and his family and the Case family were very, very close personal friends. So with that introduction, I'm going to let Jim Vankoski talk a little bit about his Sports History Museum, and then we'll let Rich talk about his book about Mickey Vernon. So, Jim, be my guest.
Thank you. Final interruption. Please identify the folks who are your co-hosts.
Our other co-host, two co-hosts that we have, David Hubler, and David wrote the book The Nats and the Grays, How Baseball Survived World War II. In Washington. David is a frequent podcaster and a host on this, as well as Ronnie Rabinovitz, who is a very interesting Minnesota Twins, Brooklyn Dodgers, Jackie Robinson, a longtime personal friend, and Ronnie is participating on this podcast as well. So,
hi, George.
Ronnie, hey, Ronnie and David, good to have you, and now we'll let Jim and Rich take over.
Well, thanks, George. This is Jim Vankoski. I'm the president of the Sports Legends of Delaware County Museum, located in Radnor Township, Pennsylvania. And I must add that we are the home of the Mickey Vernon collection. And I want to announce an exciting event, a numerous number of events that we're going to have next year, that we're going to honor the 100th anniversary of the birth of James Barton Mickey Vernon for the entire year. Mickey was born April 22nd, 1918, so this will be the 100th anniversary, and we're going to have a year-long celebration of this. So that's going to be something to look forward to. Our website, which is sportslegendsofdelawarecounty.com, is something that will be having a lot of video clips and a lot of other information regarding the great Mickey Vernon. And I say great, and Rich Westcott can verify that. I don't know of a nicer human being that ever walked the face of the earth than Mickey Vernon. And George, with your experience with Mickey is probably something that you cherish, along with your dad and Mickey being such great friends. And I think that Mickey is somebody that we should remember. My wife has a saying that we exist as long as we are remembered. And there are certain people that are worth remembering, and Mickey is certainly one of those individuals.
Well, Jim, I agree with you about that with Mickey. Mickey was such a close personal friend, and I've mentioned before, outside of baseball, he was always my Uncle Mickey when I was a little boy. The other thing I wanted to mention, and you talk about Mickey's 100th birthday. My dad would be 102 just yesterday. But Mickey and I used to talk about it, and he laughed. He said, George, I always had my phone number in the Delaware County phone book because it was always listed as Jim Vernon. And people didn't know who Jim Vernon was, but it was really Mickey Vernon. Mickey was that was his nickname, but in the phone book he had it as Jim Vernon. And he said, I never got a call. He said only friends would call me because they were the only ones who knew it was Mickey Vernon.
Well, George, you have so many firsthand stories about Mickey and your dad and all the other Washington senators. And it's true, Mickey would say, he said, people would say, Mickey, I tried to find you in your phone book, but I couldn't find you. Because Mickey Vernon in the phone book was either James Barton Vernon or just Jim Vernon or something other than Mickey. He didn't use that name
right.
in the phone book. So that is a true story, no doubt about that.
I know Mickey used to always laugh about it.
Did he ever think of changing it to Mickey in the phone book?
He never gave it a thought.
I don't think so. I think he liked the fact that he used to be his little inside joke that it was James Vernon in the phone book.
But Rich Westcott, and he'll be speaking quite a bit, I'm sure, very shortly. But that book of his, The Gentleman First Base, is there a better title for Mickey Vernon than The Gentleman First Base? Because he was a true gentleman, if there ever was one. And when I think about it, and George, you might know this, who's the sports writer that said that Mickey was wasting his time in baseball? He should be president of the United States.
Yeah, that was mentioned. Right, that was mentioned. I think maybe in Rich's book, and Rich can talk about it. Also, somebody, I think it was maybe a former ball player or sports writer, once said that Mickey Vernon could play first base in a tuxedo. He was so smooth.
That I was driving to Georgetown University for a baseball banquet at one point, and I had the pleasure of taking Mickey Vernon to this particular event. And I asked Mickey, what was the biggest compliment that was ever paid to you? And that was one of the two compliments that he mentioned that he was very proud of.
It was great. Well, that was Mickey, and a real gentleman. And Rich, I really appreciate your comments about it. And Jim, and now Rich, if you'd like to talk a little bit about Mickey and your book, that would be terrific.
Well, as Jim said, I think this subtitle, The Gentleman First Baseman, was certainly appropriate. There was no greater gentleman than Mickey, and that was I've done 26 books, and that was certainly one of my favorite projects, and it took a long time to get to it because in the early years of my trying to persuade Mickey to do a book, he didn't want to do it. And he kept saying, nah, nobody want to read about me. And I kept saying, hey, Mickey, that's not true. And we went back and forth for about 10 years. And finally I said to him, and by this time he was living in a retirement community, I said, Mickey, I'm going to London next week, and I'll be there for 2 weeks. And when I come back, I'll ask you one more time, and I'll never ask you again. So when I came back, I went out to see him, and lo and behold, before I left, I was in my first interview with him. He had agreed to do it after all these years, and to me, that was such a happy experience, as was talking to him about all those years, and I talked to many of his teammates and many of his opponents and family and friends and all sorts of people. Al Rosen, who he beat for the batting championship at the end of the 1953 season by 1 point. He did the forward, and it was just a really lot of fun to do that project. And of course, Mickey was a great subject, and I have so many great memories of that experience and writing about certain things, not only his career, but one of my favorite stories. He hit a home run to win a game in Washington, and Dwight D. Eisenhower was then the president, and he was in the stands, and Mickey was his favorite player. And as Mickey crossed home plate, Eisenhower sent a Secret Service man out to get a hold of him, bring him over to the box because Eisenhower wanted to congratulate him, which to me was a great story. I mean,
that's cool.
How many presidents would ever do something?
Yeah. That's very cool.
But, you know, it's just it has filled my mind with so many great stories, and not just his athletic accomplishments, but things off the field and all through his life. And he did have a great career. I mean, you know, he played in parts of 4 decades, 23 years, hit .286. He should be in the Hall of Fame. And I know we initiated a campaign to do that some years back, and they were wrong in turning it down, I think. And you know, he should be, but.
Well, I agree with you, Rich, and Jim as well. I mean, they were an effort was made on behalf of Mickey Vernon, Veterans Committee with the Hall of Fame, and I personally think Mickey has been overlooked, just like Gil Hodge has been overlooked, and Ronnie Rabinowitz on with us now, and Ronnie, we've talked about Tony Oliva being overlooked. So there are great players in baseball history that have not been inducted into the Hall of Fame. And in my opinion, you know, Mickey certainly should be one of them. He's a 2-time American League batting champion and just a wonderful human being. I mean, as Rich and Jim have talked, as modest and as down-to-earth person as you would ever meet.
We had I've got a picture. I see a picture of Ike and Mickey Vernon that Ike signed to him. Jim, you sent it to me. It's on those cards, you know, the Vernon's visual legacy.
Yes.
And it's a great shot. I wish I could read the whole inscription. It says to Mickey Vernon, but I can't read I can't read the rest of it. But he's holding the bat, and Ike and Mickey Vernon are just grinning from ear to ear. And of course, everyone knows what a grin Ike had.
Well, we have a photograph in the museum where President Eisenhower is giving the silver bat. The only time that happened where a president would actually give the silver bat to Mickey Vernon for winning the 1953 batting championship. And you look at President Eisenhower's eyes, and all you can see is a look of admiration while he's looking at Mickey Vernon. So you really understand the respect that President Eisenhower had for Mickey. I guess he went to, George, you would know better than anybody, he probably went to at least 7 opening games in Washington when President Eisenhower was president of the United States.
He sure did, Jim, you know, when because Mickey was the starting first baseman, and all those years that Eisenhower was throwing out the first ball, with the exception of the 1 year, I think he was playing golf or something, but Mickey was Ike's favorite player. My dad also, I also have a photograph of my dad and General Eisenhower in 1946. So, and then in 53, my dad was invited to a luncheon at the White House, you know, by President Eisenhower. So, you know, Mickey and my dad and Ike, you know, went back a long way. And I remember also a few years ago I met David Eisenhower, and David and he and I had a chance to talk at a book signing. He told me, he said, my grandfather's 2 favorite players, your father and Mickey Vernon. And you know, David, David certainly didn't have to say that, but on the other hand, David at one time had been an intern for the Washington Ball Club, and knew of you know, Mickey and my father, and certainly his grandfather was an avid baseball fan who followed Washington very much.
And George, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the clips in our video, Ball Field to Battlefield and Back, of President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, President Roosevelt, President Truman, the actual clips of them throwing out that first ball with your dad and Mickey taking the shots.
Well, you know what, Jim, you're right. And that's a long-time tradition, which it bothers me because it's no longer a tradition, but it always was a tradition. Opening day in Washington, the President of the United States throwing out the first ball.
Amen to that.
The first year that happened?
It's not done anymore, but that was a big thing in Washington to have that, and I happened to be there personally myself in 1961 to watch JFK throw out the first ball at Griffith Stadium because that was the last year that the Washington Ball Club was using Griffith Stadium. The next year they went to RFK, which had been called DC Stadium, renamed later RFK Stadium, but that's where the ceremonial first toss by Kennedy was made.
Yeah, they're just wonderful clips. And I have to mention this about Harry Truman and Mickey narrates his portion, his half of the DVD, and he had Harry Truman throwing both hands. He said Mickey wanted to make sure that everybody knew that he was ambidextrous. He could throw left-handed and right-handed.
Right.
So there's a president that threw out two balls, one left-handed and one right-handed.
That's right. He did, and that clip is in there, and it is very interesting because most of the other presidents, were right-handed, but Harry, he was ambidextrous, so he wanted to do both sides.
Gives you a little bit of an insight into his personality too, doesn't it?
Unbelievable.
What was Mickey like as an uncle? I like to find out about people based on how they relate to kids. And you called him your Uncle Mickey.
Yes, I did, Ralph, because when I was a little boy, Mickey would come up to visit during the off-season, and he'd sit me on his lap and sing me songs and had nothing to do with baseball. I was a little boy.
At the time. That was a little scary.
I think I was about 5 or 6, but the other story about Mickey Vernon. Yeah, I wanted to tell you about this because the Mickey Vernon, and this is another true story. When I was a little bit older, I was in high school, and I happened to tell my friends. This was in 1953, after Mickey had won the batting title. That Mickey Vernon was coming to, have dinner with my mother and father. And all of a sudden, here's Mickey and his wife Lib and their daughter Gay in our home for dinner. Doorbell starts ringing. I look out, and here's a lineup of kids all waiting for Mickey Vernon's autograph. So I had to be the gatekeeper, and Mickey and my dad would just be laughing and laughing because the kids were so polite, but they would just stand outside with their little baseball card, and they wanted to get Mickey's autograph, and I'd be the one to let them in. I was real popular that day.
Oh, wow, I could imagine you were.
Well, and people would go to when he lived in Wallingford for over 50 years, another Providence Township, people would just get his address and come to his door and knock on his door, and more times than not, he would invite whoever that happened to be and show him around and show him the silver bat and show him game used bats that he had of Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio. He was as Rich Westcott would say, he had that quiet charisma about him. He's really enjoyable to be around.
Yes, absolutely. I agree.
Do you think that was Mickey's personality so much as it was part of his enjoyment of being a former ball player? Because so many ball players, when they retire, suddenly look back and realize, that they influence kids and they sort of mellow. People like, I'm thinking like Ted Williams, who really sort of mellowed later on, but was just, terrible with the press and a lot of the guys during the time they played were not particularly good with kids.
Well, anybody that knew Mickey knew that he loved kids. I mean, he would carry bats and balls in his trunk, and if he saw a bunch of kids playing baseball out on a field, he'd pull over and take them a couple baseballs, take them a couple bats. As a matter of fact, he told me, he said he didn't have that much in the way of equipment, that he kept, because for one thing, the last game of the season, he would survey the crowd, and he would look for a young boy, maybe even female, I don't know, that he could give his glove to the last game of the season.
Wow.
So he would do things like that. He was just a special person.
Well, he told me a story about one time he was riding through Chester, and he went past this ball field, and these kids were playing, and they only had a couple bats and gloves, and he said, I'm going to go home and get you some stuff. And he drove home to Wallingford, grabbed some bats and balls, and came back and gave to these kids in Chester. And that was Mickey.
Yeah, and nobody would do the things he did.
May I ask you guys how it came about that he was traded to Cleveland? And he was traded with early win, so it was an instrumental deal, and it was, and then he came back to Washington. So what was that about, guys?
Well, the Indians needed a first baseman. I mean, that was the main thing, and shortly thereafter they got Luke Easter, so after that they decided they didn't need Mickey anymore and sent him away. But I think that was the initial reason.
Okay.
The Indians were
he didn't fall out of favor or anything. It was just a matter of two teams making a balanced trade.
Well, that was a pretty good trade that Cleveland made. They got Early Win and Mickey Vernon.
Yeah,
right.
Who I think Eddie Robinson, was that, who's still living to this day.
Texas.
Yeah, I believe you're right, Jim. I think Eddie Robinson was involved in that trade, and Eddie Robinson, I think, is along with Bobby Doerr and maybe one or two others, is the oldest former major league players still.
And
living.
Bobby Brown.
Yeah, Dr. Bobby Brown, right, who had been president of the American League and was a cardiologist. Very well respected. Cardiologist as well as for his baseball ability, but
they both showed up last year at the Yankees Old Timers Day,
right.
And
they're friends in Texas. They get together quite often.
Well, Eddie Robinson had a heck of a swing. I know. I've seen clips of him, and he was a heck of a ball player. Matter of fact, I have to tell you this story. And Rich and George, you've seen Mickey's Horsehide when in 1957 he got this 24-inch by 46-inch slab of horsehide, and he had all his teammates sign it and had everybody that played in the American League sign this horsehide. So this is one of the precious items that we have in our museum on display. And Eddie Robinson is one of the 50 people. There was over 200 people that signed it, 200 baseball players and managers and coaches that signed this. And Eddie Robinson, along with Bobby Shantz, I might add, who's going to be a guest December 9th at our museum, who's 92 years old. He's also one of the individuals still living that signed that horsehide. So it really is an exceptional piece of baseball memorabilia, if not the most unique piece that exists in the United States today.
Well, I've seen that horsehide. Jim was gracious enough to show it to me a couple of times, and it is remarkable. And I believe a little bit of the background, although I don't know because I never asked Mickey, but when Mickey was playing for the Red Sox, Spalding was the manufacturer of American League baseballs under the Reach label, and probably they were located in Chicopee, Massachusetts. So probably Mickey became friendly with maybe one of the Spalding executives, and that's how he came up with the horsehide. And it was Mickey's idea to get everybody who played against the Red Sox that season to sign the horsehide. So it's really quite an interesting and very unique piece of baseball memorabilia.
It really is.
What does it look like? What does it look like?
It's a horsehide.
Yeah, but I mean,
open. It's open.
We're from the Bronx.
Well, we had it when Mickey passed away. Mickey kept it rolled up for 50 years in his house. And then when Mickey passed away, in order to help keep his memory alive, we had it framed. And so we take it to different events, and people are just mesmerized. You're looking at Yogi Berra, Ted Williams, Mickey Mantle, all these Jim Bunning, all these Hall of Famers, Early Wynn signature. It almost looks like he's signing the Declaration of Independence, which brings up another point. You can read every one of these signatures. There's over 200 of them. Right. I venture to say if you had 200 professional athletes signed on a sheet of paper the size of this horsehide, you wouldn't be able to read any names.
Yeah, that's true today. That's so true.
What's the size? That's certainly the difference. What Jim is talking about, and I have a lot of the team baseballs from when my dad played, and the players did. They took pride in their signature. They signed in ink. Today, a lot of them scribble something in a Sharpie pen. You had no idea you could get it today, and tomorrow you'd look at it and say, I wonder who the heck that was.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's a totally different world than what it used to be. And what Jim is talking about with that horsehide, as most people know, baseballs are made Horsehide. That's the cover. So that probably was what, was given to Mickey, and then Mickey came up with that idea about having all the players sign it. So it's really special.
Yeah, that's why I asked what size it was. Is it a rectangular
Well, it's a rectangular. It's 22 inches by 46 inches.
Wow.
And
big horse.
It's really something to see. It's a precious piece of baseball memorabilia. It really is. But all these great signatures. And when the visiting teams came to Fenway Park, Mickey would have them all signed, and they signed by teams. So you have all the Detroit Tigers together, you have all the New York Yankees together, you have the Cleveland. It's interesting where the Cleveland Indians are. Roger Maris was the first signature on the list. Because in 1957, Roger Maris was a rookie with the Cleveland Indians. So we had Bob Feller as a guest at one point in time, and he took a look at the Horsehide. I said, Bob, if you only would have kept one more year, you would have been on here, because Bob Feller retired in 1956. So his name is unfortunately is not on there because he was no longer with the team. And Bob Feller, one of his best quotes that I remember regarding Mickey is, he said it, and Rich Westcott, you would remember this. He said, if you didn't like Mickey, you didn't like anybody. that was the thoughts of Bob Feller.
This is so interesting.
Was that true, George Case? And your dad is among those two. Nobody didn't like either of those two players, but were there exceptions? Were there any fights along the way, team brawls, that kind of thing?
Well, I think there were a few, but certainly not what you see today. I mean, today it's like, what they decide to do. If a pitcher throws close to a hitter, the hitter charges the mound, and all of a sudden all hell breaks loose. But, back then they did have some rivalries. I've seen a photograph of my dad who was involved in an altercation, with Nelson Potter of the St. Louis Browns one season. But Mickey and my dad were very similar personalities, very quiet, very unassuming, and they were extremely competitive. But I don't think that either one of them ever had a grudge or had any kind of problem with another Major League ball player. As far as I know, that never happened.
George, let me just follow up quickly on that, because when you mentioned Nelson Potter, because Washington had a number of Cuban ball players who were dark-skinned, and St. Louis was a terribly racist city at the time.
Sure was.
The Browns and Washington, the Senators, Nationals, did not get along at all, and they had numerous brawls. In fact, one of them led to a permanent split between the two managers who had been very good friends up until that time. But that's probably what precipitated what George was talking about.
Yeah, it could have been. I do remember that I asked my dad one time. I said, Pop, what happened with you and Potter? And he said, well, Nelson and I became very good friends. But he said apparently, what happened is that Nelson had thrown a pitch maybe close to my dad or something. My dad just, hollered back at him. And so then Nelson Potter hollered back at my father. And so my dad said, okay, well, we'll end this. So he laid a bunt down along the first baseline. So Potter had to run over and get it. So instead of my dad trying to avoid the tag, he ran right over Potter. So they wound up with a little skirmish in the baseline as a result. But he told me afterwards. He said Nelson and I would see each other at various events, and we used to just laugh about it because we were good friends. It just happened to be a heat of the moment kind of thing.
Yeah, those situations. I know Mickey talks about how he roomed with when he was traded to Cleveland. We mentioned that they were roommates that whole year in Cleveland. And then Mickey got traded back to Washington, and Early Wynn was pitching against Washington, and Mickey said he got 4 hits off Early Wynn. And the last hit was a line drive up the middle, and Early Wynn did not like that. He said he two things he really found distasteful was a hitter would hit one right back at him, and the other one was when somebody would bunt on him. But when Mickey hit the ball right back at him, he's standing on first base. Early Wynn says, you got to go down next time I see you. So Mickey said, true to his word, the next time they had, Early Wynn, threw at him. And Mickey knew it was, and he knew it was going to happen. He said, because that's just what Early Wynn would do.
Right. Well, that's a good story. That's a very good story, very true story about Early Wynn. Right.
One of the
pitching coach.
One of the players I interviewed for my book was a rookie, and he was telling me he came up in batting practice. In those days, they didn't have batting practice pitches. Pitches sometimes do it. And he came up, and he was a rookie. He hadn't really made the club yet, and he hit one back through the box, and Early Wynn had been pitching. And he said, I was scared to death he was going to come right after me, even though we were teammates.
So those little personality traits, they played there was only 8 teams in the league. There wasn't any interleague playing, so they were so familiar with one another, they had to know everybody's idiosyncrasies.
Well, they did, and that's what Jim and Rich, we'll talk about, because that's the way the players were. They were very competitive on the field, but off the field they were good friends, and they were all felt that they were privileged to be able to play baseball. They all enjoyed being with one another in the off season. I know my dad and Mickey used to duck hunt together, and my dad used to take ball players. He and Jimmy Fox used to hunt together. Mickey told me laughingly one time, he said, George says, I didn't really like to duck hunt, but he said, your father just loved to do it. And so, I came up one time, we had to get up at 3:00 in the morning, go sit in a duck blind. He said, that wasn't my kind of thing, but he said, you and your dad were such, my dad and Mickey were such close friends. Mickey said, I just wanted to do it for your father. That's what he loved to do.
I don't think.
What was he like as a manager? Could you guys speak to his managerial career?
Yeah.
Rich, you want to talk about that? I can mention a few things, but go ahead and talk about it, or Jim about Mickey as a manager.
Well, he started off managing the Senators, and I guess he didn't really do too well, and finally lost his job in the 3rd year. But then he managed a number of other teams in the minor leagues: Vancouver, Richmond, Manchester. And then he became, among other things, a batting coach. And one of my favorite Mickey stories was when he was batting coach of the Los Angeles Dodgers. And one of the players on that team briefly was a guy named Charlie Manuel. Well, Charlie, in my humble estimation, is one of my favorite people. He's a great guy. It was a huge mistake the Phillies made getting rid of him. But aside from that, I used to take Mickey down to the ballpark periodically. He'd want to see a game, and as I always do, I'd take him up to the press box, and we'd sit there. And one day he says, I'd like to really go down and say hello to Charlie. I haven't seen him in, 30 years or so, and could you take me down sometime? And I said, heck yeah. And I said, next time we're here, we'll go down to the clubhouse. And so we do, and I take him in, and I said, hey, Charlie, there's somebody out here who wants to say hello to you. Well, Charlie comes out of his office, and he sees Mickey, and I cannot describe the scene that took place. It was just like they hadn't seen each other in years, and yet they were such good friends. And Charlie told me over a period of time that Mickey was a major source of his development as a hitter, and Charlie, even though he didn't have much of a big league career, did have a very good career in Japan. Anyway, they come down and they're hugging and like long lost friends, and they start having this conversation, and it was such an animated but friendly conversation that other players from the clubhouse, the Phillies players, started to crowd around the group here in the middle of the clubhouse, and there's a circle of players, this before a game, listening to what they're saying. And they didn't know who Mickey was. Cole Hamel says to me, who the heck is that guy? I said, well, his name is Mickey Vernon. He's a 2-time American League batting champion, so forth and so on. Well, it was just a wonderful experience to observe that. And from thereafter, every time I saw Charlie, he would say to me, hey, how's Mickey doing? and I'd answer something, and he'd say, well, when you see him, don't forget to tell him I said hello. And that was how Mickey was with people. They just really, really liked him. And of all the people I interviewed, which came to 40 or 50, many of them ex-players, Bob Feller, Bobby Dorr, Dom DiMaggio, Ned Garver, on and on. Every one of them had good things to say about Mickey. And in fact, one of the great stories in that group was Walt Masterson, I interviewed, who had been a teammate of Mickey's with the Senators. Former pitcher, was from Philly originally. And we're talking, and he says, oh, by the way, he says, did anybody ever, when you were interviewing, did anybody say anything bad about Mickey? I said, oh, no way. Nobody's going to say anything bad about Mickey. He said, well, if they do, by any chance, he said, you give them my phone number and tell them to call me, and I will have some words for them. And, that was just, it was, to do this book was just one great experience after another, and it all proved that Mickey was just liked by everybody. Nobody disliked him. And, you talk about African-American players. Mickey was very instrumental in converting Larry Doby into an outfielder when he was an infielder in the service when Mickey managed a military team, and Mickey convinced him to convert to the outfield.
That is a very interesting story. That's an incredibly interesting story.
Yeah.
They were stationed on the same island in the Pacific during World War II.
Yeah, they were, and Jim will talk about it. But there's footage color footage in our DVD when Mickey was with the Indians at spring training of Larry Doby taking batting practice, and Larry and Mickey were very good friends. They had first met, as Jim mentioned and Rich mentioned, they first met in the Pacific during World War II, and it's very interesting to see a player the caliber of Larry Doby and to understand that probably his reason for switching from an infielder to a future Hall of Fame outfielder was a result of his being coached by Mickey Vernon.
And George and Rich, you would know this story. Wasn't it true that when Larry Doby was, 2 months after Jackie Robinson broke the color line in the National League, Larry did the same in the American League, and didn't Mickey send him over like half a dozen or a dozen bats? Just to welcome him?
He did that, and many years later I interviewed Larry Doby well before this book, but Larry was very, very complimentary about Mickey playing a major role in his career and in helping to convert him to an outfielder. In fact, you may recall when we had the luncheon at Springhaven Country Club after the Mickey Vernon statue was erected down in Marcus Hook. One of the people there was Larry Doby's daughter.
I was going to mention that. That's just a sign of respect that the Doby family had for Mickey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a nice chat with her, and she said the same things that Larry had told me some years earlier about Mickey's help. And that family...
How did it come to be that Larry Doby worked for the NBA at the end of his life and not baseball? That there was no place for him in baseball? What was that about?
I'm not familiar with that story.
I'm not familiar with either.
Oh, okay. He did work for the NBA, one of the teams or whatever. A very misunderstood man, Larry Doby, I'm sure.
Yes.
Well, you know what? It was when they're talking, and Ronnie on there on this podcast, when we speak about Jackie Robinson, but Larry Doby did break the color barrier in the American League about 2 months after Jackie. And Larry Doby was signed, to Cleveland Indians by Bill Veeck, and Bill's major emphasis was that he wanted to integrate baseball, and he originally was wanted to purchase, I think, one of the other Major League ball clubs. Wasn't able to do it, but right, Phillies, but did purchase the Indians. My dad was there, and Mickey, and he did sign Larry Doby to an American League contract, and he was the first African American player in the American League.
What a great show!
They're not too long afterward, and so did others. So, and as you mentioned, George, Bill Veeck, whose father owned the Chicago Cubs,
right,
tried to buy the Phillies. At least that's the story, although it was disputed by some people, and told that he was going to fill the roster with players from the Negro League. This is in 1943, and Commissioner Ford Frick heard about it and more or less vetoed that action and made it possible that Beck could not buy the Phillies. And at that point, the Phillies were in bankruptcy. They were run by the National League because they had no owner, nobody efficient enough to run the team. And according to Veeck, in his book, Veeck is in Wreck, that's what happened. It was a pretty telling story about the executive level of the league at that point.
Yeah, what their mindset was to equality and all that.
Is Dave there? Dave, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Because the book, The Nats and the Grays, that was a great book, by the way. I really enjoyed reading that.
Oh, thank you.
It was a history lesson. So much of World War II was involved in that. It was fantastic. And we had another event at Mickey and a gentleman by the name of Stanley Glenn. And he's Stanley Glenn, who played for the Philadelphia Stars in the old Negro Leagues. He was a catcher. And Stanley Glenn said, Mickey probably doesn't remember this, but he said he remembers seeing Mickey down at Griffith Stadium when one of the Negro League teams and that he was on, Stanley Glenn was on, was playing there. And he just talked with such admiration with Mickey, and he said if everybody had Mickey's attitude, the world would be a lot better place to live.
Well, high praise for a man, huh?
It really was high praise, and we're fortunate that we have this on video. As a matter of fact, it's in that same video, Ball Field to Battlefield and Back, George. We keep plugging that, but we're not really plugging. It's just a great
I want you to plug
video.
A little story about that DVD, just so you know. Jim and was gracious enough to invite me. Gay Vernon, Mickey's daughter, had a memorial service for her dad in Chester at Widener College after Mickey had passed away, and Jim invited me. I had a chance to talk a little bit, but then Jim and I started to have a personal conversation ourselves about, Mickey and his hobby with taking photographs and movies, and my dad had the same thing, and Jim suggested to me, he said, George, why don't we put it together? And that's where it came from. And so, it's all original color, and Mickey's voice, my dad's voice, both of them describing their experiences of playing Major League Baseball, and I know I was thrilled to do it. I really appreciated Jim's suggestion because it was fun for he and I we spent quite a few months, doing a lot of editing and cutting and doing all the things to make the DVD into a 60-minute, color documentary of World War II Major League Baseball.
Yeah, George's dad that I used. It was wonderful footage, from the ground level. It wasn't from a camera that Major League Baseball had set aside to watch various games. It was all, just personal photography right there on the field. It was terrific.
There's a shot that Mickey took of Jackie Robinson in one of the World Series. I'm not sure, in the early 50s, and he's up high in the stands. You could tell. I said, Mickey, who took this thing? He said, I did. I said, well, where were you? He said, I was watching the game in the stands. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I wanted to go to the World Series game, so I bought a ticket, went up to the stands, and took a shot. I mean, that's the type of things that he would do. He was such a fan. it was unbelievable.
Right. That's a very good story, and I do remember that footage, Jim. And the fact is, what David was talking about, in the most part in the DVD, it is actually behind the scenes footage of Major League Baseball that my dad and Mickey Vernon took. So it's not game action. You don't see guys like you see in newsreels, hitting home runs or running the bases, whatever. This is what ball players did, the life that they did, batting practice, pregame, promotions, riding on trains, doing all the things that makes the life of a Major League ball player, not what the press and the fans see, but what the actual Major League Baseball players experience during their time in the major leagues.
Yeah, the one scene that always sticks out in my head is when you see the guys from Washington coming out of this wooden barracks-like building that was their training, the dressing room. Through a screen, there's a screen door there, so it wasn't an air conditioned. And there's nothing posh about it as today's minor league complexes are. These guys just came out of what looked like a summer camp cabin,
That's what it was, David. That was Tinker
like
Field.
A summer camp, right?
Tinker Field, and that's the conditions that I've seen players sitting around potbelly stoves in the clubhouses, during a cold snap, and during World War II when they had the travel restrictions based upon World War II. Players would train in northern cities, and Washington was lucky because they trained in University of Maryland. But I've seen players, in the ski areas of the Catskills with snow on the ground throwing snowballs instead of baseballs. That's just the way they did it back then.
Yeah, and the Chicago teams had spring training somewhere out just across the border in Indiana, and they were trying to have a practice out on a golf course that was covered with snow.
Right.
That's what
there was 140 different players in that video, 80 of which served in the military. And there's only 7 still living today. So it really marks a tremendous time during the era of Major League Baseball. And George, your dad filmed from 39 to 45, and then Mickey filmed from 46, 47 up to clear into the early 60s.
Right.
So you have 140 great players.
Were there players that you had trouble identifying and that you had to do some research to find out who they were?
Actually, Mickey Vernon and George Case, in the narrative, they knew every one. They identified them all.
Right.
So we really didn't have to worry about identifying. They were all identified for us.
Yeah, what Jim and I had to do was we were doing the research into what branch of the military those specific players. But we knew all the players because Mickey and my dad were identifying. What we didn't know is that whether they were in the Army, Air Force, Marines, or whatever it was, so that we did have to do some research on. But the actual players themselves, that was no problem for us.
Well, again, it's probably part of it was due to the fact that there were 8.
Fabulous.
George. This had to be an incredible labor of love for you.
Well, it was.
It had to be, yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
you know what?
Document.
What it was, too, for me, just a little bit of a side, when my dad would come back, when I was a little boy, he'd come back from Major League season at the end of the season. He'd have his camera. He'd set up a projector in our living room. He'd say, okay, I want to show you our films from this past year. And I remember telling him at the time, Daddy, do we have to see these again? So, I mean, and then as my dad, got older, I got older, I started to realize the historical significance. So they were actually home movies, and the same with Mickey. They weren't any kind of Hollywood production. I mean, that was home movies, and the fact is that was the life of a Major League ball player during that era.
Well, when your dad took pictures of spring training of Cecil Travis taking batting practice, for example, I mean, nothing can replace that.
Right.
And Mickey taking Ted Williams and Stan Musial.
We just on a recent episode talked about Cecil Travis not getting Hall of Fame consideration.
Right.
And how great he really was.
We asked Mickey
Cecil Travis
being the Hall of Fame, and
right. Mickey and my dad
Travis
would always
was the
talk
first
about
on the list.
Yeah, they would always talk about Cecil Travis, his greatness as a player, and the fact is that he lost his prime years, World War II, in combat, and had his feet frozen, battled the bulge, tried to come back, wasn't able to regain his timing, and then retired in 47. But if you ask the bulk of major league players today and fans, when you mention a name like Cecil Travis, they'll have absolutely no idea who you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah. One other quick comment on the films that they put together. It's rare to see film of that era that's in color. I mean, if you look back at some of I remember as a kid, we never got to see a number of the All-Star games or World Series, but they would put together a film about it, and they did that with the World Series, but it was always in black and white.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And here, all of the footage in the DVD is all in color, and that in itself is a remarkable accomplishment.
Well, I really appreciate those comments, David, because that's what it was. It was color film. My dad had a personal friend who worked for Eastman Kodak, and I have the original canisters that it would come. And my dad would receive the color film from it was called Kodacolor.
Yeah.
It was very early in the development of color film. And, so my dad's hobby, he'd put in his little handheld camera, no video, none of that other stuff, and he'd just walk around the ballpark or do spring training or whatever with his handheld camera with a color film inside, and then, we'd show it later.
And he had to wind it, I'm sure, too, wind the camera to get it to film. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you had to keep winding it. And matter of fact, somebody said to me, so why don't you turn that color footage into a book, and so I did some research on it, but it was such a tedious what you have to do is that you have to go at frame by frame. An 8mm film has tiny little frames, then you have to go over that, and it's very, very difficult and time consuming and expensive. So, in lieu of a book, Jim and I decided that, to come up with a DVD was really going to give baseball fans and historians something to see.
Well, and then Mickey, we'll talk during the video about the difference between hitters in his era and hitters of today. You talked about Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio. It's just precious stuff, because not only did they film it and George's dad filmed, but they also did the narrative, which is unheard of. That's what makes it so special. Right. And I'm convinced that Mickey got the idea, George, from your dad, because in 1946, when he won his he won his first batting title, the Chester Kiwanis Club gave Mickey a Super 8 camera, and that's when Mickey started taking the images, picking up right where George Case left off.
You know what, Jim? I think you're probably right, because, the fact is that my dad and Mickey probably talked about it, and Mickey knew what my dad's hobby was, and when Mickey had a chance to get that camera, it gave him a good opportunity to do the same thing. And so it was really, both of them, it was a labor of love. They enjoyed doing it. And they weren't trying to do anything to record it for history. They were just showing people what it was like to be a major league ball player.
Is there any indoor footage? And I know all you guys will remember the lighting involved with 8mm thing, the light bars. My family had that going. And was there anything indoors?
Well, yeah. Remember, George, tell him about the Benny Bengoff series where he was giving lessons on. I mean, that was all indoors, right?
Now that Jim mentions it, that is a little bit funny, because this was between games of a doubleheader at Detroit at Briggs Stadium, and so a lot of the players are being called up. So my dad is sitting in the clubhouse at Briggs Stadium. Benny Bengoff grabs a bat, and he starts to do a rifle drill. And he's showing the players sitting around in the clubhouse between games, not talking about baseball, but Benny Bengoff showing them the kind of rifle drill they're going to have to go through if they get called up. And it was hilarious. But that's the life. I mean, they weren't again, they weren't sitting around talking about the game that they played or the game that was going to be played. They were talking about their future lives in the military.
Yeah.
So yeah, the inside footage is excellent.
Yeah, they had I don't think maybe the clubhouse had good lighting because I know it was just going to be natural lighting, and my dad did take the footage and it was pretty clear. It wasn't faded or it wasn't dark. It was very, I think it was very good footage.
Very good footage. You talked about Mickey managing in the majors and in the minors. Rich, did he manage? He managed at Richmond. I think he managed Dusty Baker there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he did.
Oh wow.
He managed in Richmond, and he also managed in Vancouver. And then his final year of managing, he had a year at Manchester in the Eastern League. But he had Dusty Baker, and then he had some other noteworthy.
Ralph Garr, I think, was another batting champion that he managed in Richmond.
Yeah, I believe so.
What year did he die, George?
Mickey died in 2008.
Okay.
September 24th,
Your dad
2008.
died, George.
And my dad died in 1989. So Mickey was gracious enough. I remember him coming to my dad's funeral. He came to my mom's funeral. Mickey was special. And the fact is, he was an honorary pallbearer for my dad's funeral. And he asked me, he said, would you mind if I was an honorary I said, absolutely not, Mickey. I said, you and my dad go back such a long way. We'd be honored to have you there. So, Mickey came on his own with his wife, Lib, came to the funeral and walked out of the church behind the casket, my dad's casket. So it was very special.
Very special. Yeah.
Well, we can tell between Rich and George and myself, we have some really tremendous memories of Mickey Vernon.
You guys have memories about all of it, not just Mickey Vernon. So I'm hoping you'll come back and grace these microphones again.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. I really appreciated Jim and Rich, agreeing to be on with us, and it was a special time for me to talk about Mickey and Ronnie. We haven't been talking with you that much, and I really appreciate you listening to all this.
Absolutely.
But all your stories that we've heard about you and Jackie Robinson and President Kennedy, and this is a little bit different when we're talking about Mickey Vernon. But it's been very enjoyable for me.
It's been very enjoyable. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot today. I thank Rich and Jim and Ralph and you, George. This is terrific.
Yeah.
Well,
I really enjoyed it.
Let's keep doing it over and over again, guys.
And if anybody is close to Delaware County on December 9th, Richie Westcott's going to be one of our special guests along with Bobby Shantz, and we're going to try to get Rich to bring at least one of his 26 books with him. All 26, at least one copy. We'll have to get a moving van to bring him in.
Having thrown to his brother as a battery mate, Wilfus Shantz.
Right.
So, and Rookie of the Year, 1950, might have been 53, as a matter of fact, Bobby Shantz.
He was the most valuable player in 1952.
Yeah,
Bobby Shantz.
52?
Yeah, I think 48. I think 1948 was his first year, and he's also a World War II veteran. He was in the Army during World War II. Right. Mm-hmm. Not many people left. If you get a chance to see Bobby Shantz, you should take advantage of it.
Not many
what great stories he had.
Of crafty left-hander. You don't hear that much.
Yeah, right.
He was Bobby Shantz, a real little guy. He was 5'7", and I think it was that 52 or 53 season pitching for the A's. He was 24-7, which is an amazing stat for pitching for a ball club like the A's.
Right.
Yeah,
he pitched about stats of those days. Remember, it was 8 teams in each league. Everything wasn't as watered down as it was then. A guy like Mickey Vernon winning 2 batting championships in an 8-team league over the course of a career.
That's incredible. Yeah.
That it really is incredible.
It's what they were. They played a 154 game schedule, and it was 8 teams in each league, no interleague play. The winner of the American League would play the winner of the National League in the World Series. That was it. Period.
That was it.
Because there was no interleague play, the excitement of a World Series was so much more than it is today.
I agree.
Yeah, the only interleague play came about in New York when they had the Mayor's Trophy game between the Yankees and the Giants. In fact, in 1 year during the war, they had played a round robin where the 3 teams.
Yeah, they had a triple header.
It was a triple header where the teams alternated, and all 3 teams played in alternating half innings. To raise money for the war relief effort.
Right.
That was great. That's wonderful.
And that they never closed baseball during the war. I think that it's so much for the spirit of this country. You can't quantify.
So good. Right.
You can't quantify.
Well, that was the object. That was the thing. And we've talked about it before. Major League Baseball was ready to shut down, but President Eisenhower, President Roosevelt, and possibly through the efforts of Clark Griffith, they kept it going, Major League Baseball season going for the morale of the country, and that's why they were prepared to shut down. But Roosevelt, with his so-called green light letter, said, we want to have the Major League Baseball season continue.
Great, that's wonderful.
Good that they did, and good that you guys gave us a great show today. I think
it was a great
show collectively.
Thank you.
I'm Ralph Tycho, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. The show is Senators, Twins, Baseball, Past, Present, and Future. Thank you all for being here, and please return again real soon. To the audience, keep on keeping on, and if you like what we do, please accumulate lightly used children's books. Take them to your Head Start program in whatever city you live in and contribute to children reading and becoming prepared to go to school. If you do that, it'll be a better world, and I'm appreciative of your effort along those lines. Thank you, everybody.
Yep.
Be well.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.